You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. It's only been a few months since historic flooding devastated parts of western Washington, where affected homeowners are still recovering. Many renters also suffered losses from those floods, and unlike homeowners, they may have had little idea that they were at risk in the first place. In Washington, home sellers are required to tell potential buyers if their properties are located on a floodplain, but landlords don't have to do the same for renters. A bill recently passed by state lawmakers could change that by requiring that rental leases include disclosures if a unit is at risk of flooding. The bill still needs to be signed by Governor Ferguson. If that happens, landlords will have to add disclosures to leases starting in 2027. Alexis Weisend is a business reporter for the Seattle Times, and her reporting on this gap in renter protections was the inspiration for the legislation that recently passed. Alexis, thank you so much for being here. And this is, something for reporters to have this kind of impact is a big deal. So congratulations on real world impact of your work.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit more about this bill. What's in there?
So this bill is very basic. It's very much a first step kind of bill. It requires that landlords, starting in 2027, as you said, include a disclosure on whether or not a rental unit is located within a floodplain. And so another part of the bill includes that landlords have to tell renters that their insurance does not cover any losses that renter might experience if the unit floods. Renter's insurance does not cover losses from natural flooding. And then the landlord's insurance does not cover the tenant's losses of personal property from natural flooding. And so what this bill does, in addition to that disclosure requirement, is it creates a requirement for a landlord to recommend that tenants also purchase flood insurance in addition to that renter's insurance because they're living in an area that is susceptible to flooding.
And just to be clear, Alexis, so if a renter has renter's insurance, they don't get reimbursed for floodwaters damaging or destroying their property?
No, people are really confused about this. And I did not know this either when I was a renter, but renter's insurance only covers water damage from like internal flooding. So like a pipe bursting or some sort of accident, like a toilet overflowing or something like that. Natural flooding is not covered by renter's insurance. You have to purchase flood insurance in order to recoup damages from like what we saw in December with rivers flooding into rental units.
Wow.
So people were very surprised to see that their renters, when they went to go file claims, the renters insurance companies told them that's not the kind of flooding that we cover. You needed a different type of insurance. And very few renters know that.
So this is sort of an extra nudge for people if they may not be aware ahead of time. They think, I have renter's insurance, but I'll be fine. But this is to make really clear, you're not fine. If this place floods, that renter's insurance and that landlord's insurance does not cover your losses.
Yes, it covers both telling the tenant in the first place who might not know that they're moving into a flood zone and making sure that the tenant understands what steps they can take or should take if they make the decision to ultimately make that move.
As I mentioned, your reporting provided the basis for this bill. How did you first come to this story, Alexis? I mean, how did you find out about the gap in renter protections in the first place?
Well, the entire Seattle Times newsroom essentially was out in the field reporting on the impact of flooding on different people across Western Washington. And I ran into a lot of homeowners that had been hit by the floods, but also a lot of renters. And the difference between the experience of the homeowners and the renters was that the homeowners sort of knew what was coming. They had experienced either flooding in the past, or they knew that their home was already susceptible to flooding. They had flood insurance most of the time. Renters, on the other hand, had maybe moved into their unit. Renters move a lot more frequently than home buyers. And so they had maybe moved into their unit a couple of years ago, a couple of months ago, and they had no idea that they were susceptible to natural flooding from rivers. And so they were very much unprepared and had maybe renter's insurance, but also didn't know that their renter's insurance would not cover any of their losses sustained in the flooding. And so they were really hit financially, sometimes more so than the homeowners, because the homeowners with flood insurance could get some of that money back, but the renters were really just out of luck.
Can you share some of the personal stories that you heard from people? I'm thinking of Rose Harry's, or maybe the Rosas family, just folks who really were devastated by this flooding. What did you hear from them?
I think the Rosas family, which was a family that rented a mobile home in a mobile home park. They weren't the owners of the mobile home in Monroe, Washington. They really captured national attention for the impact of the flooding on their family. They had this picture of their little girl who was just in her pajamas, just absolutely in tears, standing outside of their community, looking at their home that was just submerged in water, saying that she didn't have time to grab anything because the flooding came on too quickly and all she could grab was the clothes on her back, her little pajamas. And I think that the story of that family really struck a chord with people, because in this case, they had just moved into this rental home as a more affordable option because the mom was going through breast cancer treatment and they were struggling to pay for her medical bills. It was sort of a quick decision to move into this more affordable place, and they lost pretty much everything. The community has come together to help them, but they had told me that they just wished that there was some sort of warning that they had before they moved into this rental unit. And the father of this family explicitly told me, we would not have moved into this rental unit had we known that there was any risk of flooding. We would not want to take that risk, knowing how financially precarious our situation was at that point.
So, Alexis, how would this law be enforced if a tenant signs the lease and they were not shown these disclosures from their landlord, but they find out later that they actually do live in a flood zone? What can they do?
That's one of the problems that tenant advocates have pointed out with this bill, is there is really no enforcement mechanism, or I should say there's no consequence that's explicitly stated in the bill for not following this rule. And that's different from some other areas that have adopted similar rental flooding risk requirements, such as Oregon. In Oregon, when a tenant suffers an uninsured loss due to flooding and did not receive that required flood disclosure in the rental agreement, they can seek damages for that uninsured loss or for 2 months' rent. But right now, it's kind of unclear what renters in Washington can do.
And it kind of leaves it up to the tenant to keep an eye on that, to say, hey, was there a flood disclosure that I needed to be shown, basically, if there's no punishment for not showing it at this point.
Exactly.
What did landlords have to say about this bill?
Landlords, for the most part, were in support of this bill. There are a lot of different disclosure requirements that are already in leases. And so there's a disclosure requirement for mold and lead. All those are mostly about what the tenant should do in regard to taking care of the property. But they saw this as just another sort of piece of language that they have to add onto leases. Originally, when I spoke to some landlords before the bill was created, there was a concern that maybe this would be a requirement to add in that a rental unit is at risk of flooding in its advertisement for lease. And these landlords are worried that there would be sort of an ostracization of these units that are at risk of flooding, and that we would lose housing when we're in this housing crisis. But as this bill is written, that's not the case.
That didn't end up in the final piece of legislation. When it comes to the issue of the housing supply, and, obviously nobody wants to take units offline. I do wonder how much the housing crunch will end up meaning that renters who are looking for something in their budget, in the geographic area that they need to find, will just go ahead and get the lease information, and they'll be so excited that they've actually found a place that works for them, that they're going to sign on the dotted line. Like when you get all those pieces of paper when you're about to sign a lease, a lot of that, in my experience at least, is kind of perfunctory. It's just like, yeah, yada, yada. I finally found my place and I just want to sign. Is there an argument to be made here that this is really just surface level, that it's not going to go far enough to protect renters who are signing leases that put them at risk of flooding?
I think that there's definitely that argument to be made. I think that when we talk about this overall issue of the housing crisis, of climate change, of there not being enough housing for people to be able to easily make this decision of, oh, I don't want to, I'll just choose a different apartment. That is a real issue, but those don't have easy solutions. And so I think from what I heard from renters is that they would have at least liked the opportunity to be aware of the situation they're moving in. Maybe for some renters, it wouldn't change the fact that they had to take that apartment because it was the most affordable or the only one that was in their school district or whatever those reasons are. But they would have liked to have known, to be prepared, to make a plan at least, even if they couldn't purchase flood insurance, which for renters is a couple $100s a year. Even if they couldn't shell out that money, at least it wouldn't come as a surprise.
I wonder how much of this bill, too, serves almost as an educational tool, where even us talking about this on the radio provides a certain level of awareness, that, this bill is now part of it. You're going to get the paperwork if you are going to sign a lease. But also just the fact of it introduces this idea that renters are at this extra level of risk, because generally their insurance isn't going to cover flood risk, and that this potentially is just like the opening move that then leads to more action or just an increased awareness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that it is true that a lot of renters do not understand what kind of protections they have when it comes to natural disasters like flooding. But because flooding is becoming so much more common due to climate change, maybe it's time for us to have that conversation more often.
What kind of insurance, Alexis, would renters be getting? Would they qualify for like National Flood Insurance Program policies, or generally where would they be getting that insurance policy for flood risk for renters?
They would qualify for national, it's called the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. That's sort of where people can get sometimes a cheaper policy through the federal government when private companies either are too expensive or don't want to cover an area because they deem it as too risky. And renters are looking at a different kind of flood insurance coverage plan than homeowners would. With homeowners, you're covering the entire house, right? But with renters, you're just covering what's inside your house. So it's much cheaper. It's only a few $100s a year versus maybe $1,000, over $1,000 a year.
Alexis Weisend is a business reporter for the Seattle Times, and her reporting provided the inspiration to the state legislators who decided to pass this new bill to require the disclosure disclosure during the rental process, that landlords have to tell renters now if they are renting a place that is within a floodplain. Alexis, is there anything else that you think people should know about this story?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more that we need to talk about in regard to renter protections against flooding. And part of that conversation, Senator Bateman, who sponsored this bill, has already started talking about how to make flood insurance more affordable and accessible for renters, especially those who are already being squeezed by high costs of living. And so that's the next step. And then I think also we'll have to monitor how this plays out during the next flooding event. Are we going to see that people were more prepared this time? Did people look through their leases and did this provide them an opportunity? Or because this is one of those disclosures that is tucked into sort of ever-growing lease requirements, I think the next steps are looking to what else we can do in the state to increase protections for renters against natural flooding. Senator Jessica Bateman, who was the primary sponsor of this bill, she's already been talking about ways that the state can make flood insurance more accessible or more affordable for renters who are already squeezed by higher costs of living. And then we're going to have to watch during Washington's next flood event whether or not this bill, if it's signed and becomes law, actually makes an impact. Will renters be more prepared this time? Will they have read through their lease, seen this disclosure, and purchased flood insurance? Or will it not really make a difference? I'm sure that there's going to be a mixed bag, but we'll have to watch and see how this plays out.
Yeah, but the thing that is sure is that we will have more flooding events in the future in Western Washington. And so it's great to be talking about this. And just the fact of that insurance idea and whether people should be considering that as a renter is great to get the word out on. And I'd love to hear from listeners, too. If you're a renter in a flood zone, do you have a plan to get additional insurance? And what's your experience with that? Let us know by emailing soundside@kuow.org, or you can leave us a voicemail at 206-221-3213. Alexis Weisend with the Seattle Times, great reporting, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at kuow.org or on your favorite podcast app.